Robert Lang. I'm the UNLV director of Brookings Mountain West and a non-resident senior fellow of the Brookings Institution. I just got out here. If I seem discombobulated, I have yet to find a hair cutter even. I just found a dry cleaner. I'm happy with that. You know, it turns out dry cleaning comes ahead of hair, at least to me. I don't know. Maybe somebody else has a different view. So I'm happy to be here. Just a quick note on Brookings Mountain West and what we hope to do in the Valley. And then I'm going to turn it over for the speaker introduction. Our speaker's sitting right here. And he's about to take the stage. And I don't want to get between you and the speaker because you didn't come out to hear me talk about Brookings Mountain West. But a few points worth noting. It is a partnership between UNLV and the Brookings Institution. And really the focus is to look, in terms of just the Western focus this is, to look at the Western states, especially our nearby neighbors that also have big cities in them, and to discuss and to project and to understand the region's peril and opportunity. And you know, in a moment we're in right now, certainly, I think you see both threads. You see opportunity, certainly, and that's a long-standing, you know, Western opportunity. Always look to the, you know, the kind of open skies and the open trail. But, you know, at this moment, the whole engine of growth seems to have gone off the rails. And we're happy to be here at this kind of moment because I think our perspective is that this is one of the most interesting regions to study in the United States, boom or bust. In a sense, it's kind of ground zero for the Great Recession, as it's now called. And it provides a lot of opportunity for, and a breathing space in a way, for a discussion of how do we go forward? Because we've just been through terrific growth in this region, and it wasn't so terrific in its multiple outcomes. You know, I'm sure a lot of people would trade it now, you know, all the complaining about, you know, there's people in front of me on the highway. That's you know, the highways open up a little when you're not growing. So these are the topics we're covering. Also, all of Brookings is interested in coming out and exploring the linkages and having a discussion with the UNLV faculty about bigger questions, national and international. And the lecture series is really about the bigger picture, and you'll be getting other events that we're planning for this spring and this fall that are focused more on Las Vegas and, you know, comparing it to Phoenix in terms of its growth, its politics, its everything. So stay tuned for that. And what I'd like to do now is turn it over. Tony's going to come and introduce our speaker, who we're happy to have. Thanks a lot.
I'm Tony Hetchinova. I'm the Associate Executive Director for Sustainable and Clean Energy Programs at the Harry Reid Center for Environmental Studies. Boy, that's a mouthful. It was my pleasure to be one of the two faculty liaisons for Pietro Nivola's visit, and I'd like to introduce him. Pietro Nivola is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he holds the C. Douglas Dillon Chair in Governance Studies. Dr. Nivola was Vice President and Director of Governance Studies at Brookings between 2004 and 2008. He began at Brookings as a visiting fellow in 1988 and was appointed a senior fellow in 1993. Prior to that, he had been an associate professor of political science at the University of Vermont, and in 1976 to 77, a lecturer in the Department of Government at Harvard University. Dr. Nivola received his A.B. and Ph.D. from Harvard University. He also holds an MCP from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Dr. Nivola was awarded Harvard's Frederick Sheldon Traveling Fellowship and was a Samuel Andrew Stouffer Fellow at the Joint Center for Urban Studies at Harvard and MIT. Dr. Nivola has written numerous books and articles on subjects ranging from energy regulation and environmental protection to trade and industrial policy, urban problems, federalism, and American national politics. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Pietro Nivola.
Well, thank you so much, Tony, for your kind introduction, and Rob as well. It's a real pleasure to be back out here. This is my second time out, and I had so much fun last time. I brought my wife, who unfortunately got a little bit under the weather, so she can't be here this evening, but she told me that she made me swear that I'd be on my best behavior, so I'll do that. I'm going to talk today about some work I had done years ago in which I've sort of tried to update, comparing the factors that influence the form of cities, cityscapes, if you will, in Europe and the United States. And in thinking about how to sort of open up this subject, it occurred to me that one way to present it is this. When I was younger, I used to love to go to Paris. I still love to go to Paris, but in those days it was sort of my form of Vegas. I just loved it. Well, when I was young, if you go up to the top of the Eiffel Tower and you put a franc into one of those binoculars at the very top of the Eiffel Tower. I'm talking about the Eiffel Tower in Paris, not the one on the strip here, which is quite a tall building. You put a franc in those binoculars, you could actually see the outskirts of the city, and you could see farms spread out on the periphery of Paris. Back in New York City, where I was born, if you went to the top of the Empire State Building, and where they have these binoculars as well, and you put, I guess it was in those days just a nickel or a dime into those things. It's $5 now. You would see nothing but sort of megalopolis sprawling out as far as the eye can see. And this contrast is what I want to talk about today, and also about its implications, particularly for the usage of energy. Why is it that the American city, the American metropolis, sprawls so much, whereas the cities of Europe, including huge ones like Paris or London, remain relatively compact? Now, of course, they're growing and they're sprawl all over the world, including in Europe, but they are relatively compact in comparison to our major metropolitan areas. And what difference does this make? I'm going to divide my observations into basically 4 parts. I want to begin by describing, if you will, some of the, call it sort of the market forces that are behind this. Differences in geography, demography, economics, technological factors, and so on. And then in the second part of my talk, I want to talk about the policy mix, the role of public policies that have also shaped urban form. Then I want to say a few words about why we should care about all this. And finally, maybe a word or two about what, if anything, can be done or should be done. So, Bill, yeah, let's do the first slide here. These are some of the fundamentals, things to remember about the American landscape, basic features here. One is an enormous amount of open space. What we have here is a chart, a slide that just shows you how much more dense the European continent is, eastern and some parts of western and some parts of Eastern Europe. If you look at population per square kilometer or per square mile, it's much more dense in Europe than it is here. If you look, as you can see, where's the little gizmo here? The little
it's disappeared.
Did I stick it in my pocket? Okay. Well, anyway, I can do this just by pointing. I mean, you can see, as soon as you get west of the Mississippi, it is wide open. And if you do the next slide, there's a familiar site, the state of Nevada. What I'm trying to show there is what Las Vegas was like back in the 1960s and what it's like today. But it's still, it has grown. It's you can see the red mark on your left-hand side, I guess it's your right-hand side, but it's still, a tiny little blip on this huge expanse of territory. Now, I know most of it's public land and so on, but still, this gives you an idea of what we're talking about here. it occurred to me that it would have been interesting to, if I had to redo this chart, to put, let's say, something like the Netherlands up there and compare it to the state of Nevada. And the Netherlands would look like a little postage stamp in comparison with this. With every square mile or every square kilometer in Holland, basically, created by sort of dikes to keep out the ocean. Land is very scarce in a country like that. There's simply no room for a place like Las Vegas in a tiny, small land area like the Netherlands. Apart from this sheer abundance of space, here are some other factors to keep in mind. Next slide. One of them is population growth. If you look at this chart, the top line, which is the red line, shows population growth in the United States. The rate of our population growth is much higher than it is in these other Western industrial countries. They go up and down. Some of them have not had even a replacement rate of natural increase. Italy is an example of that. And of course, population growth is crucial to urban development, because cities can only grow cities have to grow, and they can only grow in three possible directions: inward by crowding, or upward into high rises, or outward. And where you have the pressure of population growth, as you've had in this country in comparison with these others, and you have all that land available, it's not surprising that most of the growth is going to be outward. Next slide, please. Here's another factor that's important in the demographics. If you look at this, the United States has a younger population. The yellow part of the bars there is senior, old people like me, 65 or over. And we have a smaller fraction of that than these other countries do. We have a larger fraction of population that's under 15 years old, children. And families with children need more space. They need bigger housing. They need more dwelling space. So it's not surprising that these are the families that move to the suburbs to accommodate their younger households. See if you can hit it again and see. There we go. Okay. Here's another thing that's distinctive about the U.S. A very high degree of physical mobility. People move a lot in this country. Almost 40,000 Americans moved in the year 2008 from one place to another. You don't find, if I had done a pie chart like this for, Italy or France, you wouldn't find anything like this. Most people in those countries stay put. They have, therefore, a stronger sense of place, if you will. If they grew up and their families were from a particular city, whether it's Florence or Milan or, Lyon or whatever, they stay there. They stay very close to the neighborhoods where their families are from. Here, people move around. They move across the country. They certainly move a lot within their states. This kind of mobility pattern has implications too. Next chart. Now, I know that it's going to sound funny to say this at the moment, particularly out here in Nevada, which is kind of as Rob was saying, is the epicenter in some ways of the Great Recession. But still, let's face it, America is a very rich country with a very vibrant, powerful economy most of the time. And what this chart shows you, we're the top line, the big red line on top. The other countries just do not have the same level of wealth that we do. And with Americans having a much higher share of GDP per capita than these other countries have had for most of the modern era, it's not surprising that more Americans have been able to afford to buy their own homes, with a lot of land, certainly backyards and so on. That's not the case, and has not typically been the case even in most of Western Europe, which is still also a very wealthy place. When my father returned to Italy right after World War II, as he said, you know, he went back and he found people, as he put it, living on trees. I mean, obviously a lot of the country had been devastated by the war, but, you know, back right after World War II, Americans were heading for the suburbs by the millions into new tracts of suburban developments. That was not what was happening in Europe at the time. So we have a formidable economy. Wait, stay with me for just a second before we flip to the next one. We have basically a formidable economy, a very technologically advanced economy, in which decentralizing technologies got an early start and made a huge difference. Let me give one example. On the eve of the First World War, the British automobile industry was cranking out something like 34,000 cars a year, kind of in the fashion of almost like a cottage industry. At about the same time, the Ford Motor Company's assembly lines here in the United States were producing over 800,000 cars a year. By the year 1928, just before the crash, more than 80% of all the automobiles in the entire world were in the United States. And in the mid-1920s, close to half of all families owned a vehicle of some sort. It took well after World War II for the Europeans to reach those levels of automobile ownership. And of course, once you own an automobile, you know, you're cut loose, you're footloose. You can move around. You can commute from low-density suburbs to anywhere else in the metropolitan area, and you create this sort of autocentric, if you will, urban ecology that is distinctive of the American cityscape. Okay. Now, the factors that I've just discussed, geography, demographics, economic and technological factors, and so on, are not the whole story, though. And maybe the simplest way to say this is by taking the most basic factor that shapes the urban landscape, which is, as I said earlier, population growth. If you take an area, let's take, we could take Cleveland, I suppose, or Buffalo, but let's take Detroit, the Detroit metropolitan area. In the years between 2004 and 2008, the Detroit metropolitan area, and by the way, I'm speaking of the whole metropolitan region here. I'm not just talking about the central city of Detroit or the inner city. The whole metropolitan area actually lost about 75,000 people. Yet if you were to look at the consumption of land for development, it was still going up. It wasn't going up at the rate, of course, that Al Gore had at one point mentioned, which was there was a period in certain parts of the country where like 50 acres an hour were being consumed in ex-urban development. But still, even in the Detroit metropolitan area, which was losing population, consumption of land was increasing. So this suggests that, you know, Mother Nature is not the sole reason for why we have our dispersed, highly decentralized urban pattern. The U.S. Also spreads out its cities because of a very distinctive policy mix. So here we go. And when one looks at the policies that have had implications for urban growth patterns, one shouldn't just look at so-called urban policies. You have to look well beyond that. And here's an example. It turns out that if you were to measure agricultural subsidies in Europe and the U.S., you would find a chart kind of like what you're looking at, where the top lines, purple and yellow, are one is for the EU, the other is for all the industrial countries put together. But if you look at those, that's a pretty high level of agricultural subsidies in relation to farm income. The blue line at the bottom is the United States. We do subsidize our farmers, we know that, but we don't do it on the level that the EU does by any stretch of the imagination. Now, what does that imply? Does anybody out here in the audience want to answer this question? What does it mean if you heavily subsidize farms on the outskirts of cities or anywhere else in the country? Fire away.
They would remain more economically viable as a land use, and it would be more cost-effective to keep them in production.
Exactly. That's exactly right. What happens is farmers are less eager to sell off their land to developers if they're heavily subsidized and their incomes are propped up through heavy subsidies. So, by the way, I'm not making a case for this. I'm just saying that this is what the Europeans do, and it helps explain those farms on the outskirts of Paris and elsewhere. Second chart. In order to get a lot of suburban expansion, you literally have to pave the way for it. You have to build a lot of roads and highways and especially freeways. And one way to do that is to pour most of your tax dollars for transportation into roads and related expenses, as we do in the pie here on your left. But I wanted to compare that to I picked a country out of the hat, United Kingdom, and look at how much more is spent on public transit than is spent just on highway construction. That helps, I think, to partly explain why there is less suburban growth in the UK than there is here. There is still a lot, but it's nothing like it is here. Next chart. Okay. Here's another key difference that I think really helps shape the form of cities. Differences in national tax systems. In the United States, we have very limited use of sales taxation. I know we all pay a state sales tax and stuff on everything we buy, but it's nothing compared to what they do in Europe, because in Europe they have a value-added tax, which is a sales tax essentially on every single thing you buy, and it's very high. We in the U.S. give preferential tax treatment really to consumption, especially of housing, because unlike most other industrial countries, we, for example, allow mortgage interest deductions on income taxes. In general, we favor income taxation, and we have a very limited application of consumption taxes. It's it's not totally the other way around in Europe. The Europeans also tax income heavily, or they try to. In Italy, they don't always get away with it. But certainly, as I said before, the consumption taxes are staggering in Europe. And on top of the value-added tax, you also have extremely stiff taxation of energy, and that's what this first chart is showing you here. This is the price of unleaded gas in the first quarter of 2008. The top bar is the United States. The blue, by the way, the little code there is small, so you may not be able to read it very easily. But blue is just the market price of gasoline. Yellow is the tax that's added on top of it. So your end price is this is what you think. These are the prices on the ends of those bars, okay? And the U.S. tax is trivial in comparison with what you find down at the bottom. The bottom one is Norway, but just on top of that is the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and so forth. In other words, over $8 a gallon for gasoline in Holland. Flip to the next chart. This is just to show you that diesel fuel is taxed extremely stiffly as well. I mean, in Europe, by the way, roughly half the automotive fleets are diesel powered, so it's not like you can get out of being taxed by just getting rid of your gasoline powered car and going to diesel. The taxes are high there. Now, what does that mean? It means that people not only buy bigger cars, but they drive them around a lot more. And if you go to the next chart, Bill, whoops. Okay, I'll tell you what, go to the next one. There we go. And then flip, and then we'll go back to the electricity chart. It means that, okay, what you have here is just a sense of how much Americans are dependent on automobiles and how much less dependent how much less use they do of public transit, bicycling, or walking to work. I mean, if I had put the city of Copenhagen up here, you would be startled to see that roughly 30% of the commutes in Copenhagen consist of going to work by bicycle or on foot. Okay, can you think of an American city, including New York, where that's the case? There's nothing like that here. So, you know, people live much closer to their city centers in Europe because of these very high prices they have to pay for automotive fuel. And you can see that by the higher rates of public transit use, by the number in Germany, 12% of people bicycle to work, 23% walk to work, and so on. Okay, now let's flip back to the chart on, not that one. There we go. Now here's another thing that's striking. You know, we don't just have very low bargain basement prices for energy in this country. We also, for automotive fuel, we have it for other kinds of uses of energy that are associated with dwellings. Electricity is an example. I could have put a chart here on natural gas, for example, which is also very cheap compared to Europe, and it's the principal home heating fuel, as you know. But this is a chart on electricity prices. The United States is that, again, that bottom red line, and the other lines are the other countries, France, Germany, Italy, United Kingdom, and so on. Look at the much higher electricity prices in those countries. Now, what does that imply? It implies that Americans can live in bigger houses with bigger appliances, you know, big refrigerators, big freezers. And if you have those things, you're less dependent on your little neighborhood shops and retail outlets, on the mom and pop stores just around the corner. Because you go to the supermarket, you stock up, you put everything in the fridge or the freezer, and you're basically home free for at least, you know, a week or if not a month. If you were living in Paris, I would dare you to try that because you can't. The typical Parisian apartment barely has any refrigerator at all, and certainly doesn't have anything like a freezer in it. So every day you go out and you get your baguette or your groceries and so on at the corner market. And it implies a very different way of living. Now, since I'm on the subject of little neighborhood retail outlets, I should mention, to be frank, that these are not just there because of the higher densities in European urban neighborhoods. They're also there because they're deliberately protected by public policies. The neighborhood shops survive in Europe. It's even more true, by the way, in Japan, where there has been a long tradition of pretty stringent protectionism against larger retailers. But in Europe, the preference for these neighborhood markets and so on is not just a preference for what's quaint and picturesque and so on. There are deliberate policies against too many bigger retail outlets, supermarkets and so on, there are restrictions against predatory pricing, or what we prefer to call discounting and sales. I mean, the Europeans have sales, but they're just certain periods of the year, whereas we seem to have sales all the time. And there are restrictions on hours of operation. You know, it doesn't make sense to have a big supermarket in an urban neighborhood unless you can basically stay open around the clock, because that's how you get the economies of scale. But if you restrict hours of operation, those bigger retailers just don't want to settle in. So I think some of this, all this, by the way, has started to change a lot in Europe. So, you know, it's not, and it varies from country to country and city to city. But I still think it's basically the case that there is more deliberate protection of small mom and pop, if you will, type stores in the European cities than there is here. What are the implications? Well, consumers naturally pay more for what they consume, for what they buy. If there are no Walmarts, you're going to pay a lot more for everything you buy. But on the positive, if you will, or the other side of the coin is that it maintains this rich density of small, convenient stores and markets, often in the nicer parts of Europe, with a lot of very good fresh produce and so on. I should mention, you know, in the U.S., it's often the case that when we try to bring people back to live in the central cities, we fail to realize that there's a distinct disadvantage when you move to some inner city neighborhoods in the U.S. because you move in, there are condos and apartments going up and so on, but there are not necessarily enough of these smaller convenience stores. So, for example, for a time, I had friends who lived this was in Washington, D.C., up near the archives, near the Navy Memorial. There was a beautiful apartment complex that was created there. But there was no place to buy groceries within easy striking distance of that. So they would have to get in their car and drive out to one of these bigger markets. And I guess the question that they started to raise is, gee, why should we bother to live inside the district when we're basically living the same way as we would if we were living out in some suburb, having to get in the car and go out and buy all that stuff. All right, let's move on here. This chart's just showing you how much more we drive than is the case in those 4 European countries. Okay, now here's another factor that's important. Education, systems of education. This chart is showing you a basic fact. We spend more on education at all levels, not just higher ed, which is the pale green thing, but the darker green, which is primary and secondary education. We spend a lot of money. We don't skimp on education. Next chart. But are we getting our money's worth? Yes, this is just for high school math and science scores. We seem to be doing better than Italy does, but we're not doing certainly not doing better than the other countries that are on that slide. Okay, hit it now. No, go back. Okay, thank you. Now, where is the main problem? The main problem is in the inner cities. And this is where I would love to have had the pointer, but I can explain to you. If you look at this complicated thing on the left here, the red dots in those lines are urban school districts. The sort of yellow or yellowish ones are the suburban districts. And what this is just showing you is differences in graduation rates. They're much higher in suburban school districts than in urban ones, and that's true seemingly across the board. These are a whole mess of major metropolitan areas in this country, and it's true across the board. The weak school systems are in the inner cities. The good ones are in the suburbs. The map over there on the right-hand side is where Bill comes from here. Bill Brown from the Boston area, and Boston is that red part. The suburbs are all the different kinds of blue, and you can see that the graduation rates are always much higher in the suburbs than they are in the central city. So with this situation, not surprisingly, a lot of families that are trying to educate their kids move to the suburbs. Now, part of the explanation, it's not the only part of the explanation for why we have these kinds of disparities, but the Europeans, or at least certain European countries such as France, have less of them, is because we have a strong tradition of local control over schools. The French, for example, have a very centralized nationalized system with national standards. At the end of the equivalent of high school, you have to take a test called the baccalaureate, and everybody takes the same tests, and so on. So it doesn't really matter as much where you're going to school in France, whether it's a city or a smaller town or outside the city. Anyway, so these are just some, what I've tried to do here is illustrate some of the policy differences that I think have an impact. And by the way, as you can see, they're not things that we usually think about when we try to explain urban sprawl. Who would have thought, for example, that agricultural policy is a big factor? But it is, I think. I could go on here. When I first wrote about this subject, I included a discussion of the problem of crime and law enforcement. At the time, crime rates were very high in the inner cities, and people were fleeing the inner cities because of the crime problem. That has changed, and much of the urban exodus is no longer really doesn't have that much to do with the crime problem. But that one could go on here and talk about other types of public policies as well. Why should we care about sprawl? When I first started thinking about it, I actually got kind of baffled. I wasn't sure that it really was such a terrible thing. And I still to this day don't think it's a terrible thing. It has an upside as well as a downside. It means that people live in less congested conditions. They have more housing. They have more breathing room. The housing is, housing tends to be cheaper in this country per square foot, or however you want to measure it. I don't believe that urban planners and students of this question have ever done a really comprehensive benefit cost assessment of urban sprawl, looking at all the positives as well as the known negatives. That said, there's just no question that our highly decentralized pattern of urban growth is one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons for our highly energy intensive society. So, Bill, if you can flip to, this is where we want to flip to the next one. What this is showing you is levels of energy consumption in the U.S. Again, we're the big red line. The other countries are the way down below. We're sort of in a league of our own in terms of energy intensity. Now, obviously, this is not just because our cities are spread out. And everybody has to get around by car. There are lots of other factors. Again, distances are great, geography, and lots of, the wealth of the country and so on. There are factors that account for our big footprint here, but it is still the case that the shape of our cities does does influence this. And the next chart is going to show you, by the way, the carbon footprint, which is basically, if you can do the next one, carbon footprint reflects the energy intensity. The more energy you use, the more fossil fuels you consume, the more carbon dioxide you emit. And again, we're in a league of our own compared to these other European countries. Well, why is it that our urban form contributes to some of this? There are basically two reasons. One is what I've just been saying all along here, which is we're so dependent on automotive transport. Most of the vehicle miles traveled that we rack up, most of the trips we take are, by the way, in urban areas. They're not in the hinterlands. They're not, farmers traveling long distances in cornfields. Most of our automotive usage is definitely inside metropolitan areas. So that dependency on automotive transport accounts for some of this. The other thing is that when you have a lot of detached structures, with 4 walls and a roof, you tend to leak more energy than you do in buildings that such as high rises and so on, that compress dwellings into single structures, larger, unified structures. Now, I should stress here that there is no, the fact that sprawl has some of this effect is not an iron law. I mean, you could envisage or imagine a society where, let's take Vegas or Phoenix or LA. If every building here had its own little solar power generator or something, then it would use less energy or electric power anyway from central power plants than maybe even a higher density city such as Paris would. And likewise, you can make an argument that when you get too much density, you create too much congestion in the transportation sector, and that results in a lot of traffic, a lot of stop-start driving, heavier use of fuel, actually, because you get more effluents per vehicle than in a low-density place where traffic is free-flowing and so on. And, as my colleague Tony Downs wrote in a very good book for Brookings years ago, you can get, the places that are most stuck in traffic can sometimes be the worst offenders in terms of excessive energy use, and those are places where traffic isn't free-flowing. And I have to confess that, as much as I love Paris, the worst traffic jam that I've ever been in was getting from Charles de Gaulle Airport into Paris, and so it can happen. Nonetheless, I think there's still an overall correlation between low density and energy intensity. Maybe one of the best studies of this was a study of the Greater Toronto area in the 1990s. And the people who worked on that study found that they estimated that if urban development 30 years out had the same density as the core of the metropolis had instead of the periphery or the suburban ring, the metropolitan area of Toronto would claim about 20% less energy intensity just in the transportation sector alone, which is kind of striking. Okay, well, next. I'm trying to wrap up here so we can have at least a few minutes for discussion. Whoops. Okay. What should we do? I think that some of what we have been trying to do for many decades now has been kind of ineffectual. And I'm thinking of the long history of urban renewal projects and urban redevelopment schemes, the building of convention centers, sports arenas in downtown, and so on. This is not brought population back from the suburbs and into the cities. It does, if you do it really beautifully, like Las Vegas has done with the city center, and you have really top-notch, world-class architects doing it, that can help. But all this effort to kind of rebuild the central cities has not amounted to much in terms of stemming the suburban exodus. Same goes for massive investments in rapid transit lines, especially rail transit, elaborate rail systems in low-density cities. It just doesn't work. You don't have the critical mass along the trunk lines, the corridors, to get enough ridership. And in any case, it's very hard to sustain these systems where the cost of fuel, gasoline and so forth, is cheaper than bottled water. So the preconditions aren't there. Should we take a page from Europe? No. First. I am not in favor of lavish agricultural subsidies or protectionism or nationalized educational systems. I'm not convinced that these things necessarily raise living standards. So I think we kind of have to give up on the idea that U.S. cities will ever begin to look like Paris or Amsterdam or Rome or something. We have to accept the urban form that we have, and our best bet is to develop adaptive technologies, cleaner cars, tighter buildings, and so on and so forth. But is there anything that we might want to emulate from Europe? And I would say sort of a qualified yes here. When it comes to tax policy, I wouldn't import the European tax system, but I would say that we're in need of massive overall tax reform in this country that begins to tilt our tax system a little more on consumption, especially of pollution and greenhouse gases and that kind of thing, and a little less, or maybe not just a little less, quite a lot less, taxation of earnings, savings, and investment. Earnings, savings, and investment are things you want society to do. Creating pollution and over-consuming, especially over-leveraged consuming, is something you don't want society to do. Sorry that I went on so long, but let me stop there. Rob.
Can I make just a quick notation? In the Brookings Mountain Megas piece, the West had a low carbon footprint. The reason is that Las Vegas is densely built. How is it densely built? It is the second most densely built urbanized space in the United States. It has federal land holdings, aridity, high mountain surroundings around it. So its urbanized area, which is 97.5% of the population, is 1,000 persons per square mile or more, only exceeded by Los Angeles, and behind it is New York. It's effectively 8.8 people per acre. And as a result, the whole Intermountain West is dense. You want to know what's not dense? Atlanta, Nashville, Charlotte. Nashville has less than 50% of its entire so-called metropolitan urban population living below 1,000 people per square mile. So it is a giant countrified city. We looked small and dense and compact, and LA is small and dense and compact. LA is smaller than the built area of Connecticut with multiple times the population. It's that we don't have use of it except for automobiles. We're essentially dense sprawl, dense urban and auto-dependent sprawl in a way. So we have an urban design problem rather than the problem of just outward projected growth. And the key thing being high slope, aridity, and federal land holdings. If you look at California, it's built on a small coastal shelf. Everything after that is mountains. It has held it in. Nothing's holding in Dallas. Nothing's holding in Atlanta. So there are relatively contained spaces out here. And the West is actually quite efficient. If you throw some solar panels atop that, then the West's numbers come down even further. And so, it's not the worst case scenario here. You give this talk in Atlanta, shame on you, Atlanta. Give this talk in Las Vegas, and this may be about the most efficiently built city. Also, this city has a highly concentrated urban core of workspace in the Strip. And it has central commuting that looks like Chicago in that regard. But it has no transit system that is developed around it. It has one of the best opportunities for an airport to downtown Strip run where people prefer not to have automobiles comment on drinking. And so high-speed rail, yes, between Los Angeles and Las Vegas goes from the two densest urbanized metropolitan areas in the United States across a space that is the most heavily traveled, less than 300-mile rather, distance in the United States in air traffic, and it would substitute for that. So don't let, the sort of aggregate perception of the United States cloud the local conditions in our understanding of Las Vegas's opportunities, lost opportunities.
And I would add one other footnote to that, which is that most of the growth in Las Vegas has been contiguous growth. That's true of Los Angeles as well. But in some of the other places you mentioned, it just hopscotches around, and that is where you just simply can't solve the problem by public transportation systems. Yes. Way in the back. Yeah.
Way in the back.
Okay.
I'm Bruce Turner with the Regional Transportation Commission. I have one very brief statement.
Sure.
And then I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
We are, in fact, building the largest bus rapid transit system in the United States at this time. When I say that, I mean it is either under construction or under contract now. It is coming from suburbs and is going to be centralized, and we also have a transit, express bus from the northwest that will end here, just across the street from this building. Now my question is, so are you saying then that Henry George was right, that a single tax based on land proximity would be, or land use would be the thing to do?
No, I won't go that far. I would just suggest that, we ought to consider perhaps something like the European-style value-added tax for consumption as a whole, nothing just strictly targeted on land, but swapping that for a reduction in some of the other tax burdens that we have, especially in the income tax or payroll tax area. On your point about the transit improvements here, I mean, improvements in bus systems is the answer in cities like this, clearly, because they can move around in all different directions and they can make use of the existing infrastructure. Where I would have some criticism would be when you have a low-density environment and people insist on building, massive rail transit lines. I mean, even in Washington, we have this wonderful metro system, rail system, but it's hard to justify it when it gets out to the really low density areas, because it's just not going to be able to collect enough ridership to make it yield net benefits. The one thing you can say about these rail improvements, subways and so on, is that over the long haul, they may begin to collect some development at the nodes, the major stations, and that to some extent has happened in the Washington area. But anyway, I commend you for improving the bus systems, and the use of buses is the natural answer in a city like this. Yeah, sir.
This might be off the subject, but I'm wondering, has anyone studied what would happen if you made bus fares free, for example? What would be the increase in number of people that would use it, the decrease in consumption of gas, all that other stuff?
Free. I mean, there's the only place where I've taken a bus that's really free. There are two, actually. Aspen, Colorado. It seems to work there, actually, but that's because the skiers, just take advantage of it. And the other place is Stanford University. And at Stanford, no one seems to be on those buses when I'm on the bus. I don't know. I mean, these big buses are roaming around the entire campus. It's awesome. But, I'm like I and the bus driver are frequently the only people in the bus. In fairness to Stanford students, they use bicycles in lieu of buses. But seriously, though, yes. I mean, if you lower the price to zero, you're going to get more demand, obviously. You will get more usage. but you know, there's no free lunch. I mean, somebody's got to pay for these systems, so you know, some taxpayers somewhere are going to have to subsidize it to the tune if you have no user fee at all. But you know, as far as particular examples beyond that, I don't know of many places that have free, totally. Rob, do you want to weigh in on free bus transit systems?
The freest buses in America are the transit between the airport and the rental car. They're paying you for something on that.
Yeah.
It's free.
Yeah.
When you get to the rental car place, it's not free.
Right. Yes, ma'am.
I didn't hear you talk at all about the cost of the sprawl of infrastructure and the benefits of infill, especially as you compare the U.S. and Europe. Do you have any notion that that's a real contributor to you know, the long-term costs of sprawl?
Okay, let me see if I understood your question.
Water, wastewater.
So that if you fill in between these developments,
I would say we're subsidizing development going out because we're not really making the development pay the true cost of you know, going further and further out on our water and wastewater systems in particular.
yeah, that's probably true. I mean, we could price these things at their true cost, and rather than in a sense sort of give them a pass.
Albuquerque does that, by the way. They have a citywide impact fee that's based on distance from core. And so they do
Yeah.
an estimation of that cost.
Very few.
Yeah.
Right.
Most are just-
I mean, it goes back to the point. By the way, the question here was whether it if you could rechannel investment in infrastructure so it was contiguous rather than just leapfrogging around from one place to another. It would help create sort of this notion of more of a critical mass, which then can sustain improvements like transit and so on. Yeah, and I think that that is worthwhile
And
doing.
also the emptying out, the cost of emptying out. I was just up in the stratosphere and I looked down on the east side and it just looks like all of a sudden there's just a vast wasteland.
Yeah.
Well, TRP did the cost of sprawl and the cost of sprawl revisited, which Tony Downs participated in.
Yeah.
And they came up with ratings for every state. Like in South Carolina, you can't believe just road costs would sink the state budget on trend development if you didn't deflect some of that. So it's one of the better, the aesthetic argument usually doesn't work and all that, but the argument against the cost of that in especially the southeastern U.S., the opportunities to leapfrog here are you're going to have to ask the Bureau of Land Management for the land to go leapfrog onto. There's no ex-urban fringe to Las Vegas.
Right.
It takes you hours to get out of Atlanta. By the time you're out of it, you're in Chattanooga. You could drive right out of this place. You could go to the top of the stratosphere and you could see the edges of this region. It is fairly well delimited.
Right.
And the consequence is that it's a testing range, or it's jackrabbits after a certain point.
No, you certainly see that when you fly in. It's an entity. Yeah. Yes, sir.
It's interesting, a lot of these things, when you look at the various different energy consumption, cost of housing, miles of travel per capita, whatever the measures are, they seem to vary inversely to population growth and the sustainability of these societies long term. For example, the highest cost of energy is in Italy, and yet their population is least sustainable. So the interesting thing about all this is, yes, all of these things are true that we're observing about energy consumption and so forth, but the fact that these things are relatively inexpensive mean that goods and services are affordable, particularly for poor people in our society and immigrants. So I guess the question is there a correlation between the sustainability of the population and the cost of energy, goods, and services?
That's a terrific point, and I hope that that I didn't leave the impression that I would in any way disagree with you. I think you're onto something there. One of the reasons why you have such a low birth rate and actually a declining population in a country like Italy is because of the cost of dwellings, and that's related to the high cost of energy. you know, so people cannot afford, literally cannot afford to have their own, even their own apartments, and to raise a family in those spaces. Or they, you know, and if they can, even if they can afford to, well, I shouldn't say they can't afford. It's just not comfortable. Okay, it's not pleasant, and so yes, I suspect there's a great deal of truth to that. That when you have an expanding population, one of the elements of sort of this opportunity society is that your lower costs of energy make it possible for people to accommodate this growth. Okay, and so when I said earlier that one should really do, you know, a very broad, comprehensive cost-benefit assessment of this, that is precisely the kind of point that should be factored into the equation on the benefit side.
How about healthcare costs?
Healthcare costs. I'm trying to think how that would relate, but I will say, yeah. I mean, look, there is no doubt that if you are always sitting down, and which means, you know, you're in your car for everything you do, you're not getting any exercise. It's that simple. And so yes, I mean, you know, if you go to countries where people have to bike to work or walk to work, that is, it's a limited form of exercise, but it's more exercise than many Americans get. So there may be a connection with public health, but I think it's probably a stretch to make too much of that. Although, you know, there's certainly something to be said for people getting up out of their cars and moving around by other modes, mainly with their feet or bikes. Yeah.
There's a big literature on that, by the way. I call it the Fat Kids in the Suburbs literature. For a while, the whole Journal of the American Planning Association was nothing but articles paid for by Robert Wood Johnson about kids gaining weight because they weren't in subdivisions.
Right. Well.
And it turned out to be like 2 pounds. It was like, you know, it wasn't a lot in relative terms. It wasn't the thing that would sink suburbia. Costs, you know, environmental impact.
But reversing suburbia would be a very expensive way of solving that healthcare problem.
Except the effort that you would have to do to move everything.
Right,
really
right.
Lose weight.
Yes.
I was told that Las Vegas gets over something like 300 days of sun. Is there any model for solar, say, using more solar development, solar cells?
Well, that's, yeah, no, that, in this part of the world, in this part of the country, that's up and coming. But, you know, barring, we still haven't had the kind of breakthrough that makes solar panels completely competitive with the alternatives. They still have, you know, if you don't have the tax credits and you don't have, in a sense, the subsidies, especially when the price of traditional fossil fuels drops down, these alternative energy sources are not as competitive. But certainly, you're right. I mean, in the Southwest and in this part of the West, solar is an alternative, or will become eventually a major alternative, and especially if there's a technological breakthrough that makes it, you know, cheaper to adopt. The trouble with solar, though, is that for the rest of the country, or the rest, you know, other parts of the world, is that, you know, lots of places where it's try to picture solar panels in Britain.
They have them in Germany, and they're so efficient, and they're so much better than ours, that when they did the solar decathlon, not only did the German house win, the German house could have provided the electricity to the American houses.
Yeah,
because
but
when you have no solar energy coming down, you have to be super efficient in that.
yeah, but then on that point, Bill, can you whip back up, just quickly, go back to the electricity chart if you could. let's see. Back. Sorry about this, but I just want to make this point because there we go. Okay, you know what Rob just said is true, but it certainly helps that Germany's price of electricity is way up at the top of that chart. Okay, because that means that you know, with those kinds of prices for traditional sources of electricity, all right, then naturally, you know, solar and other alternate wind power and so on are competitive. But if your prices are down where our red line is, that's the U.S., it's a lot tougher for these alternatives at this stage of the game. Eventually, they may break through. Do you follow my logic here? Okay.
France is doing well off nuclear there.
Yeah.
Flatline.
France is
Yeah, it's steady. The U.S. is gaining on France, it looks like it. Nuclear is working out for France based on that.
Let's see. France is the black. Yeah. But that's because once you've put in the nuclear plants, the operating cost is the marginal cost is flat. So yeah, I mean, and they, you know, as many of you know, France produces more than 75% of its electric power with nuclear plants.
Why is the cost of energy so high in Germany? Sorry.
Okay, it's not just Germany, as you can see here. I mean, it's the other countries too. There are these consumption taxes, and it's just it's more heavily taxed. That would be the main explanation. Unless is Oliver here, or is he taken off? Because he's from Berlin, he could have given you a straight answer. Yeah, I mean, you know, the costs of energy are higher in Europe because of heavy taxation. Yes, sir.
It seems striking to me about the electricity or the carbon footprint in your later slides.
Yeah.
Is not so much that our footprint is twice of what Europe is, which is true, but nobody seems to be getting any better. So over the last 17 years, essentially everybody is using the same amount of energy and has the same size footprint as they did before.
So we have like 100 million more
With the
people.
increased awareness of energy usage, that nobody's getting any better.
Well, Germany's working on that.
Well, you know, the Europeans, this group, you know, these countries in here, okay, they are basically so energy efficient already. They don't have that much more to go. I mean, yeah, there will be improvements at the margin, but they're not going to make, you know, it's not going to be a dramatic. It's not the inflection point that you see. You know, you're not. What's not on this map? What's not on this chart is the 1974 energy crisis, that revolutionized energy consumption across the industrial world, and we got a whole lot more efficient. The Europeans got mega efficient. Okay, so unfortunately, my chart doesn't show that. But you're not going to see an inflection point like that from 1990 to 2005. There was a run-up in energy prices starting in the late 1990s, and that's why we have something of a little blip up on the top of the U.S. one that you can see there. But yeah, I mean, we can do a lot better. The Europeans can do better up to a point, but they're already, you know, they've kind of maxed out. Yes?
Thanks for showing dates up to 2005 and 2006, so that's a 4 or 5-year-old information. So from that period till now, have there been things that actually have improved?
From 2000 to 2005 on,
Yes.
have there been any major changes in these graphs? You know, yeah, they may have moved a little bit, but nothing dramatic. You know, energy prices have been very volatile. They've gone. There've been some. You know, there have been huge surges, but then it's dropped back down. And what it takes to bring about a transformation is very high prices over an extended period of time. And that's what happened in the 70s, because we had two crises. We had one in the beginning of the 1970s after the Arab oil embargo, and the quadrupling of oil prices then. And then we had one at the end of the later in the 70s with the Iranian hostage crisis and the Iranian Revolution and so on, and prices doubled again. So when you have those kinds of shocks and sustained over a period of time, that's when you start, when people start changing their habits.
And so the oil prices that went up to like $4 a gallon for that short interim here in the United States, did that have any impact?
It did briefly. Well, it did have an impact. How lasting the impact is not clear. But for the first time in many, many years, vehicle miles traveled dropped. People got rid of their SUVs, started dumping their SUVs and buying much more efficient cars. There was a real behavioral change. But the question is, will that stick? And it's hard for it to stick if prices then sag back to $3 or less, $2 and so on. $4 a gallon seemed to have been the tipping point, the threshold that was necessary to really bring about a shift. So again, that's an argument, I think, for using taxes perhaps as a way to keep those prices up at a level that encourages some of this change. If prices fall back all the time, then consumers and even businesses just make some progress for a while and then they backtrack. I should add one other point to what you asked there. I mean, we now have, there's nothing like a good big old recession like this one to reduce consumption. So this is a kind of an aberration right now. But I think when a real recovery gets underway, you're going to see people going back and back to their old habits pretty much, unless energy prices soar, which is not likely in the immediate future. Okay. Thank you so much for coming. I had a great time.